Welcome back, and joining me now is the Institute of Public Affairs Chief Economist Adam Creighton, and good to have you in Sydney in studio,
Indeed.
Adam.
Yeah.
Now, Trump's State of the Union address today, what did you think were his strongest remarks?
Well, I think on the economy, I think you'd have to say that the first 12 months have been pretty good in that regard. I mean, he has many detractors, as you know. He mentioned the Nobel Prize-winning economists that he said got it totally wrong, and indeed they kind of did, especially on the inflation rates, the growth rates. I mean, the US economy is still the standout economy in the OECD. OK, it grew at 2% last year, but that's still much better than the European Union and much better than Australia and much better than New Zealand and all the rest. So, you know, it's a difficult time for the West, but the US is still a standout. And if you look at where all the smartest people in the world want to migrate to, it's still the United States. You know, for all the stuff about Trump, that's where they want to go.
Although, of course, there's different economies within the US, and a lot of people are leaving New York because of the tax situation there. I just want to ask you about tariffs and then inflation. So starting with tariffs. So Trump this week increased or announced global tariffs would be a flat 15% after the US Supreme Court said that his pre-existing tariffs were unlawful. You know, the detractors, the argument has been that the US tariffs would drive the US economy into recession. What do you think the impact's been?
Well, that's why the economists have been so wrong, because they clearly haven't. It's one of the fastest growing economists in the OECD. And, you know, somewhat comically, they all said, these economists, there'd be a big spike in inflation in the US because of the tariffs, and it's just simply not happened. Their inflation rate's 2.4%, I think, over the 12 months of last year. Australia's is 3.8, much, much higher. So tariffs clearly have not been a disaster. And I think, as you said this week in one of your editorials, they need the money. I mean, the US has a massive budget deficit, $2 trillion a year or something. The debt's $38 trillion. The White House only has one way to raise money without Congress, and that is tariffs. And so I think, you know, Trump doesn't often put it that way, that we need to raise money, although I think he actually did in the speech for the first time. But, you know, it raises $300 or $400 billion a year. That's a massive amount of money, and it's not really hurt American consumers so far that much.
So he's actually trying to tackle the debt here.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And they have to, because otherwise there'll be a huge global financial crisis. I mean, you know, $38 trillion, right? It's 110% of GDP or something. That's much higher than Australia's debt relatively. The US, of course, because it's so big and powerful, it can go on for much longer than other countries. But at some point, it's not sustainable.
You just mentioned inflation in the US compared to Australia. So 2.4% in the US, and news today that inflation is now sitting in the past 12 months at 3.8% in Australia. Why do you, as an economist, think that it is so much higher, and is this because of the Albanese government? Well,
it certainly is partly. I mean, there are budget deficits as far as the eye can see, and certainly government demand plays a big role. We've had the fastest growth in government spending since the Whitlam years, except for the pandemic. 27% of GDP now, I believe, the federal government is, which is extraordinary. That's obviously boosting demand. And it's partly their responsibility. Our inflation rate, I think, is more or less the highest in the OECD.
Are you worried about it?
Yes, of course, because it hits every single Australian's wage. I mean, who's getting a 4% pay rise every year? Certainly not me. Maybe you are, Sharri, but I'm not. And that's a 4% cut in your living standards every single year. So it's a very serious problem. And the government just kind of hand waves it away as if it's not important. But I think they're going to pay for it at the ballot box.
Now, I was watching Chris Kenny's program earlier this evening, and he had Pauline Hanson on, and she said, because Chris was quizzing her on one of her new policies of income splitting, and she said, well, that bloke Creighton, she couldn't remember your first name, but she said that economist Creighton endorses this policy. So what do you think of income splitting as an economic policy?
Well, she must have been referring to my tweet about the fact that the One Nation has more policies on their website than the Liberal Party, which is true. But the policy of income splitting is reasonable. The US does it. You know, you either file as a single or you file as a married couple, and that has tax consequences. And
so if you file as a married couple, that means the tax rate is lower?
Yeah, so basically if there's only one income earner, you basically divide the income across the two people, and because of the progressive rate, that means you get two tax-free thresholds instead of one. So it makes a big difference to the average tax rate. That's something we could do in Australia. I think it's probably a good idea. It does cost a lot of money, though, in terms of lost revenue. So you have to make cuts. The other good thing about One Nation is they at least have the courage to point out on their website the things they would cut. You know, $20, $30 billion a year of climate change nonsense they would cut, and that's what needs to be said, I think, by the Liberal Party for them to have similar policies.
All right, Adam Creighton, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Sharri.